the year 1902, the Ravenhurst family arrived in the northern countryside of England, a place shrouded in fog and silence. Their new estate stood at the edge of a forgotten forest, its black iron gates opening to a long gravel path that led to a mansion built of dark stone. Locals whispered about the land. It had once been the site of an abandoned monastery, burned to ash after a series of unholy rituals were discovered there. No one ever rebuilt upon it until the Ravenhursts came. The family was admired for their wealth and refinement. Lord Alistair Ravenhurst, stern yet charismatic, brought his wife Eleanor and their 3 children, Jonathan, Isabella and Thomas, to this grand estate. On the surface, it was a picture of prosperity. But even from the first day, something felt wrong. The servants noticed it first. Doors that locked themselves, cold draughts sweeping through sealed rooms, candles snuffed out by unseen hands. And at night, the children claimed to hear monks chanting in the halls, though no one else heard a sound. One evening, just weeks after moving in, Lord Alistair threw a banquet to mark his family's new beginning. The house was filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Yet in the middle of the celebration, he collapsed, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with terror, as if he saw something standing over him that no one else could see. By the time the doctor arrived, Alistair Ravenhurst was dead. His body had no wounds, no illness, no explanation. Only a strange black mark had formed over his heart, like a burn. The tragedy shocked the guests, but what followed was worse. That night, Eleanor awoke to the sound of her husband's voice calling her from the garden. Shaking with grief, she went to the balcony, but what she saw made her scream until her throat bled. There, among the trees, stood Alistair, his face pale, his chest sunken, the black mark glowing faintly in the moonlight. By morning, Eleanor was gone. Her body was discovered at the edge of the forest pond, her face twisted in terror, her fingernails torn as though she had tried to claw her way back to life. The children were left alone in the vast estate, now half-orphaned and trembling. Neighbours whispered that the land was cursed, that the Ravenhursts had built their home on ground that belonged to death itself. But the family refused to leave. Pride, wealth and tradition chained them to the house, even as grief dug its claws deeper into their hearts. And so, with Alistair and Eleanor gone within a single month, the Ravenhurst Curse had begun. After the sudden deaths of Lord Alistair and Lady Eleanor, the Ravenhurst estate fell into silence. Servants left one by one, muttering that they would rather starve in the streets than remain in a house where the dead walked in the halls. Only a few loyal caretakers remained, their faces pale, their eyes always watching the corners of the rooms as if expecting something to step out. The 3 children, Jonathan, 15, Isabella, 12, and Thomas, 7, were left under the guardianship of their uncle, Sir Reginald Ravenhurst, a cold man with sharp features who cared more for the family's reputation than for their safety. "This house is our legacy," he would declare, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "We will not abandon it because of childish fears." But the fears were not childish. Jonathan, the eldest, began hearing whispers at night. They did not come from the wind nor from the servants, but from the walls themselves. At first they called his name softly, almost kindly. Then they grew harsher, commanding. "Downstairs. Come downstairs, to where your father waits." On one stormy night in November, Jonathan followed the whispers down the grand staircase. Hours passed, but he never returned. By dawn they found him in the great hall, his body sprawled across the marble floor, his skull cracked open as if he had fallen from above, yet no one had seen or heard him fall. The Ravenhursts buried Jonathan in the family crypt, but whispers followed his coffin into the earth. Isabella, fragile and quiet, grew more disturbed after her brother's death. She spoke of a woman in black who stood at the end of her bed each night. "She smiles at me," Isabella whispered to her uncle. "She says Mother wants me with her." Sir Reginald dismissed this as a child's imagination, but the servants began crossing themselves whenever Isabella entered the room, for her eyes had changed. The were distant, like she was already half gone. One winter morning, Isabella was found in her bedroom, lifeless. Her lips curved in a faint smile, as though death had whispered a secret she gladly accepted. No mark was found on her body, no cause for her passing. It was as if she had simply decided not to breathe anymore. Now only Thomas remained, just a boy of 9 by then. Too young to understand, yet old enough to be terrified, he clung to the servants, refusing to sleep alone. He often cried out in the night, insisting he could hear his brother's footsteps on the staircase and his sister's laughter echoing from the walls. "They want me to come play," he sobbed, "but I don't want to go." Sir Reginald, stubborn as stone, still refused to leave the estate. But the servants knew what the family would not admit. The Ravenhurst children were being claimed one by one, and Thomas's time was running out. The curse had already begun its feast. By 1909, the once lively Ravenhurst estate had become a mausoleum. Dust settled thick on velvet curtains, the mirrors were veiled, and only half the rooms were ever lit. The laughter of children was gone. The halls echoed with silence broken only by the creaks of wood and the sigh of wind through cracked glass. Thomas Ravenhurst, now 11, remained the last of his siblings. He grew thin and pale, his childhood stolen by the suffocating weight of grief. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words chilled those around him. "They're waiting for me," he whispered to the servants. "Jonathan and Isabella. They come to my window at night. They say I'll be happier if I join them." The servants begged Sir Reginald to take the boy away from the house, to send him abroad or to distant relatives. But the uncle's pride was iron. "This is the Ravenhurst legacy," he declared. "The boy will grow to inherit it. He must face his fears." But fear was not the enemy. Something far older was. One storm-lashed night in October, Thomas vanished from his bed. The sheets were neatly folded, as though he had calmly risen to leave. A candle still burned beside the bed, untouched, yet the wax had not dripped, as if time itself had stilled in that room. The search lasted until dawn. Servants combed the estate, the forest, the pond where Eleanor had died. Finally, they found him in the family crypt. The iron doors had been locked from the outside, yet somehow the boy was within, lying on the cold stone floor between his siblings' coffins. His face was calm, almost peaceful, but his eyes were open, wide and glassy, as though frozen in the moment he had seen something no child should ever see. The doctor who examined him could not name a cause of death. "It is as if his soul was pulled from his body," he muttered, trembling. The tragedy broke what little remained of the household staff. Most fled, refusing to stay another night within walls where the dead claimed the living. Only Sir Reginald remained, wandering the mansion like a shadow, drinking heavily and muttering to himself. "They were weak," he would say, slamming his fist on the table. "The Ravenhursts are strong. The house cannot harm me." But even he knew the truth. At night, the boy's laughter echoed through the halls, thin and ghostly. Doors slammed in empty corridors. A piano played in the drawing room, though no hand touched the keys. The portraits of the children seemed to follow him with their eyes. Within months, Sir Reginald was found dead at his desk, his body slumped over a decanter of brandy. His heart had simply stopped, though his face was contorted in terror, his eyes staring into a corner where no one else saw a thing. With Thomas gone and Reginald following soon after, the Ravenhurst estate was left in the hands of distant relatives. Yet by then, the curse had already taken root in the bloodline, and whispers of death would follow the family wherever they went. The Ravenhursts were no longer merely cursed, they were being hunted. When Sir Reginald died, the estate passed to his nephew, Charles Ravenhurst, cousin to the late Jonathan, Isabella, and Thomas. Charles was a young man of 26, newly married to Beatrice, and already a father to an infant son, Edward. Unlike those before him, Charles did not fear the stories that clung to the house. He dismissed the tales of whispers, apparitions, and sudden deaths as the superstitions of peasants and drunken servants. "There is no curse," he insisted. "There is only weakness of mind. I will restore the Ravenhurst name." And so, in the summer of 1915, the family returned to the mansion. But from the moment they crossed the threshold, the past stirred. The air seemed heavier, as though centuries of sorrow clung to the walls. Beatrice complained of sleepless nights. She swore she could hear a child crying in the nursery, though Edward slept soundly in his cradle. Servants spoke of doors that unlocked themselves in the night, windows that rattled though no wind blew, and mirrors that clouded over with breath, though no one stood near them. At first, Charles dismissed all of it, but on the eve of Edward's first birthday, something happened that even he could not deny. The family gathered in the dining hall, a small celebration lit by candles. As Beatrice lifted the child to kiss him, the flames suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness. A sound followed, a chorus of whispers, low and insistent, echoing through the walls. Edward began to wail, his tiny body shaking in his mother's arms. When the candles flared back to life on their own, every glass on the table had shattered, and in the dust that settled, words had been traced across the long oak surface. "He is ours." Beatrice fled the hall, screaming, clutching her son. Charles tried to be strong, but his hands trembled as he cleared the broken glass. He could no longer deny that something unseen had staked a claim on his child. Over the months that followed, Edward's health began to fail. He grew pale, thin and fevered, though no doctor could find a cause. He would wake in the night, gasping, pointing toward the ceiling, saying only, "The black man is watching." Beatrice became frantic. She begged Charles to leave the estate, to save their son before it was too late. But Charles's pride was a trap. "We cannot run," he said. "This house is our blood. If we leave, we lose everything." In December of that year, Edward died in his sleep. His face was calm, his body untouched, but his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling as though still fixed on the figure only he could see. Beatrice broke soon after. Within weeks she was found drowned in the very pond where Lady Eleanor had perished years before. Charles, now alone, finally began to believe in the curse. But by then, it was too late. Death had already marked the next generation of Ravenhursts, and it would not stop. After the loss of his wife and son, Charles Ravenhurst became a hollow man. The once proud heir walked the mansion halls like a shadow, muttering to himself, drinking heavily, and scribbling strange notes in the margins of old family ledgers. He became obsessed with the idea that the curse was not a curse at all, but a bargain. He scoured the Ravenhurst library for clues, poring over ancient volumes that had belonged to the long-dead monks whose monastery once stood beneath the house. His journals spoke of forbidden rites, of voices that whispered promises of power in exchange for obedience. "We are not victims," he scrawled in a shaky hand. "We are chosen." But the house did not reward him. It broke him. The servants, terrified yet bound by loyalty and poverty, endured his descent. They watched as Charles locked himself in the drawing room for days, chanting in a tongue no one understood. At night, they heard him crying out as though unseen hands gripped his throat. The walls of the mansion began to bleed black damp that stained everything it touched. Food rotted overnight. Mirrors reflected faces that were not their own. By 1918, the staff began fleeing. First the maids, then the butler. Only two remained, a cook named Agnes and a stable boy named Daniel. Both claimed they stayed because they pitied Charles, who by then looked more corpse than man. His eyes were sunken, his skin grey, and his breath smelled of earth, as though the grave itself was inside him. One night, Daniel awoke to the sound of screaming. He rushed to Charles's chambers and found the man standing in the centre of a circle drawn on the floor in ash. Candles burned around him, though no one had lit them. His body shook violently, his head thrown back, eyes rolled white. From his mouth poured a voice that was not his own, deep, echoing, layered with countless tones. Agnes dragged Daniel away, Biff, or he could step inside the circle. The two fled into the night, but when they reached the gates of the estate, Agnes collapsed. Her skin turned cold, her lips blue. She died with her eyes wide open, as though something had followed them even beyond the house. Daniel escaped to the village, wild with terror, and told what he had seen. Few believed him, but those who did refused ever to go near the Ravenhurst estate again. The house was abandoned by all but Charles himself. In the spring of that year, Charles was found dead in the great hall by a visiting solicitor. His body was seated upright at the long dining table, a goblet in his hand, though the liquid inside had long turned black. His face was frozen in a grotesque smile, his eyes fixed on the empty chair opposite him, as though he had been drinking with someone unseen. The solicitor sealed the house, declaring it unfit for habitation. Yet the Ravenhurst line did not end with Charles. Distant cousins scattered across England remained alive, and the curse was patient. It would find them. After Charles's death, the mansion stood abandoned, its windows like hollow eyes watching over the fog-choked countryside. The locals crossed themselves when passing by, whispering that the house was no longer empty. It had simply grown tired of waiting. Ownership of the estate passed to two distant cousins of Charles, Francis Ravenhurst and his sister Agatha, who lived far from the cursed land in London. They had grown up hearing fragments of the family tragedy, but dismissed them as exaggerated stories meant to frighten children. They had never stepped foot inside the estate and swore they never would. But distance did not save them. Francis was a lawyer, sharp-minded and ambitious. In the summer of 1923, he began to suffer from strange dreams. Every night he saw the old Ravenhurst mansion, its doors opening slowly, inviting him inside. The dreams grew darker. His dead relatives appeared at the long dining table, their faces pale, their mouths moving without sound, their eyes locked on him. He awoke each morning drenched in sweat, his body aching as though he had walked for miles. At first he tried to ignore it, but soon the dreams bled into his waking hours. Walking the streets of London, he would see children with the faces of Jonathan and Thomas, or hear Isabella's laughter echoing in the crowd. He confessed his torment to Agatha, who urged him to rest. But rest brought no relief. One night, Francis's neighbors heard a crash from his apartment. When they forced the door open, they found him sprawled on the floor, blood streaming from his mouth. His fingernails were torn, as though he had clawed at his own throat. The coroner wrote the cause of death as suffocation due to unknown circumstances. Agatha, shaken but stubborn, swore she would not succumb to superstition. "My brother was ill," she told friends. "That house cannot touch me." But her certainty began to crumble when she returned home one evening to find her parlour filled with the scent of pond water. It clung to her clothes, her hair, her very skin, though no source could be found. Soon after, she began to see her reflection moving differently in the mirror. While she stood still, the reflection would tilt its head, smile faintly, and mouth words she could not hear. By autumn, Agatha vanished. Her body was discovered weeks later, floating in the Thames. Witnesses swore they had seen her the night before, walking along the riverbank, holding the hand of a pale little boy in old-fashioned clothing. But when pressed for details, none of them could remember what the boy's face looked like. The city papers reported her death as an unfortunate suicide, but whispers spread among those who knew the family. The Ravenhurst Curse had followed them across counties, across cities. No distance, no denial, could break its grip. The house may have been locked and abandoned, but the curse had learned to travel, and now it had tasted freedom. By the early 1930s, the Ravenhurst family name had become a ghost story told in taverns and whispered in schoolyards. Few bore the name openly, ashamed of the shadow it carried. But bloodlines are difficult to erase, and scattered across England, descendants still lived. One of them was Margaret Ravenhurst, granddaughter of a cousin who had fled the estate decades earlier. She was a schoolteacher in Manchester, known for her kindness and her steady smile. She had never even seen the Ravenhurst mansion, yet the curse found her just the same. It began in her classroom. Her pupils started drawing pictures of a dark house they had never visited, a house with too many windows and crooked towers. When asked, they said, "The lady in black told them to." Margaret laughed it off as childish fancy, until the drawings grew more detailed, precise down to the cracked stonework and iron gates. Children who had never met spoke of the same house in the same voice. Then the voices began. One afternoon, during a reading lesson, the children froze mid-sentence, their voices blending into a single, unnatural chorus. Their eyes rolled back, and together they whispered, "She is one of us." Margaret screamed, knocking over her chair. The children collapsed to the floor, confused, claiming they remembered nothing. But Margaret knew. She recognized the tone. It was the same whisper her family had described before their deaths. She left her post at the school, convinced she could escape. She moved to a boarding house across the city, telling no one her name. But the curse was relentless. In the streets, strangers began to greet her as if they knew her. "Evening, Lady Ravenhurst," they would murmur, tipping their hats with dead eyes. She would hurry past, heart pounding, but when she looked back, the strangers were gone. The final night came during a storm in October of 1931. Residents of the boarding house awoke to the sound of piano music, soft, haunting, drifting through the halls. None of them owned a piano. They followed the sound to Margaret's room. The door was locked, but inside they heard her voice, pleading, sobbing, begging someone unseen to take her somewhere else, anywhere else. The cries ended with a sharp scream, cut short. When they broke down the door, Margaret was gone. Only her shoes remained by the bed, neatly placed, and the window stood wide open, though the rain blew inward. Outside, the muddy street showed only one set of footprints, bare feet, that led away from the house and stopped in the middle of the road, as though she had vanished into the storm itself. The newspapers wrote it off as a disappearance, but whispers spread. The Ravenhurst Curse had revealed itself before witnesses, not hidden in shadows, but openly, boldly, in the eyes of many. The curse was no longer content with secrecy. It wanted the world to see. The world burned in the Second World War, and yet the Ravenhurst Curse did not fade into the background. It thrived in it. While bombs fell and soldiers marched, the old family shadow hunted its scattered bloodline, finding them in trenches, in hospitals, in shelters. One such descendant was Captain William Ravenhurst, a decorated officer in the British Army. Tall, proud and fearless in the field, William laughed at the idea of a curse. "War is the only curse," he told his men. But in the winter of 1942, strange stories followed him across Europe. His platoon reported that during night patrols, they often saw a boy walking just beyond the firelight, dressed in tattered clothes, barefoot even in the snow. William would chase after him, but the boy always vanished before he could be caught. "You're seeing ghosts," William barked, though his hands shook when he lit his cigarette. In the Battle of El Alamein, William earned distinction for leading his men through brutal fighting. Yet the night before victory, his tent was found ripped open from the inside. His body was discovered sprawled across the sand, eyes wide, mouth filled with blood. There were no wounds, no enemy near him. In the dust, his men swore they saw footprints, small, barefoot, circling his corpse. Back in England, another Ravenhurst descendant, Evelyn Ravenhurst, a nurse in London, worked tirelessly in makeshift hospitals during the Blitz. She had heard whispers of her cursed family, but dismissed them as distant myths. Yet as bombs rained over the city, she began noticing something no one else did. When the air raid sirens wailed, she would see a figure standing calm in the chaos. A woman in black, pale face hidden beneath a veil. Evelyn would watch in horror as the figure pointed towards certain houses, moments before those houses were destroyed by fire. One night, Evelyn followed the figure into an abbey, unwound station tunnel. The deeper she walked, the colder the air became, until frost bloomed on the tunnel walls, though it was midsummer. The figure stopped, lifted its veil, and Evelyn screamed. She was found the next morning at her hospital desk, her body stiff, her face locked in terror. Her hair had turned completely white overnight. As war ravaged millions, the deaths of two Ravenhursts might have gone unnoticed, just two more names among the endless dead. But to those who knew the family's history, it was a grim reminder. The curse was unstoppable. Bombs, bullets, or borders could not shield them. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Ravenhurst family tree had thinned to a handful of distant cousins. Some changed their names, some fled overseas, hoping distance, oceans, or new identities might break the chain. But the curse had proven one thing. It did not care about wars or borders. It did not care about names. It only cared about blood. The war ended, cities rebuilt, and the world tried to move forward. But the Ravenhurst Curse did not belong to the past. It adapted. By the 1950s, only a few surviving branches of the Bloodline remained. Most had changed their surnames to bury the shame, but their blood still tied them to the house that waited. Among them was Dr. Lawrence Hale, a psychiatrist in London who, unknown to his colleagues, was born Lawrence Ravenhurst. He had abandoned the family name after watching his mother waste away under mysterious circumstances. He believed that burying the name would bury the curse. For years it seemed to work. He became respected, confident, even arrogant. But in 1954, his patients began to complain of strange phenomena. They swore their doctor's office smelled of pond water, that shadows lingered behind him, that sometimes in the reflection of the window they saw not Lawrence, but a pale man with sunken eyes. At first, Lawrence dismissed this as mass hysteria, but the events grew darker. One patient, a soldier traumatized from the war, slit his own throat mid-session while screaming, "The house is calling him back!" The death shattered Lawrence's composure. He began drinking, wandering the streets at night. Neighbors swore they saw him talking to invisible children, smiling faintly as he argued with the empty air. By 1957, he was found dead in his study, his wrists uncut, his body intact, but his skin was covered in writing. Words carved into him, as if by a hand unseen. "You cannot change your name. You cannot change your blood." The newspapers buried the story, but whispers spread. Meanwhile in America, another Ravenhurst descendant, Clara Whitmore, née Ravenhurst, tried to escape across the ocean. She married, had 2 children, and swore never to speak of her lineage. Yet the curse was patient. Her children began waking in the night, speaking fluent Latin phrases they had never been taught. "The monks are teaching us," they said with innocent smiles. Clara's husband thought it was imagination, until one night he awoke to find his son standing over him, holding a shard of glass. The boy whispered, "The dead are asking when you'll join them." Clara fled with her children back to England in 1962, hoping to find answers at the abandoned Ravenhurst estate. But when she arrived, the gates stood open as though waiting. The house, untouched for decades, showed no dust, no decay. The doors opened at her touch. No one ever saw Clara or her children again. Their car was discovered parked outside the gates, doors ajar, headlights still glowing weakly. Inside the house, on the grand dining table, 3 plates were laid out. Food, steaming hot, though no living person had prepared it. By the late 1960s, the Ravenhurst family was almost extinct. Only a handful of distant kin remained, scattered and fearful. Some lived as recluses, some sought religion, some turned to madness. But they all knew one truth. The curse would not end until the last drop of Ravenhurst blood was gone. And the house was waiting. By the early 1970s, only one known Ravenhurst descendant remained, a young man named Edward Finch, born to a branch of the family that had hidden itself under new identities. He was 27, a quiet historian at Oxford, known for his obsession with folklore and ancestral myths. He knew about the curse, but like many of his generation, he dismissed it as superstition. Until the letters began arriving. They came on parchment, written in a spidery black ink, unsigned. The first simply read, "The house remembers you." The second, "Your blood is almost finished. You are the last." Edward tried to laugh it off, but unease gnawed at him. He traced his genealogy late into the night, only to discover the truth. He really was the last living Ravenhurst. His cousins, distant uncles, all gone, through war, madness, or sudden deaths. One night in October 1973, Edward received a final letter. No words this time, only a charcoal sketch of the Ravenhurst estate drawn with chilling precision. On the back, a single line, "Come home." Against reason, he went. The house loomed as it always had, its towers crooked against the autumn sky. The gates swung open, as if expecting him. Inside, the halls were lit by faint candlelight, though he had brought no matches. The air smelled of decay and roses. In the grand dining room, the long table was set for one. At its head, a high-backed chair waited. Edward sat, trembling, as whispers filled the room. Not from outside, but from within his own blood, his veins pulsing with voices. One by one, the shadows of his ancestors emerged from the corners. Thomas, the first heir. Eleanor, the mother who watched her child drown. Margaret, the teacher who vanished. William, the captain who fell in the sand. Clara, the mother who never returned from the house. All of them, pale and silent, gathered around the table. Edward tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Finally, he whispered, Why me? A single voice answered, though it seemed to come from every ancestor's mouth at once. Because blood must return to its source. The candles extinguished. The doors slammed shut. The villagers who dared approach the estate days later found the dining room empty. The chair where Edward had sat was vacant, though his clothes lay folded neatly upon it. His body was never found. But from that night onward, no one reported seeing the Ravenhurst Curse claim another. The whispers stopped. The letters ceased. It was as if the curse, having consumed its final heir, had finally fed its hunger. Yet the house remains. Even today, travelers who pass the crumbling gates say they see a flicker of candlelight in the windows, or hear faint piano music drifting on the wind. Some claim if you listen closely, you can hear laughter, crying, and the rustle of many voices. The Ravenhurst bloodline is gone. The curse is silent. But the house still waits.